Mount Rainier is one of the most dangerous stratovolcanoes in North America. Its ice-covered peaks, rising to 14,411 feet, attract thousands of climbers every year. But this mountain is not just a test for the brave. It hides deadly traps, vast glaciers covered in a network of invisible crevasses, rockfalls, and sudden weather changes. The challenges of mountaineering on glaciers cannot be overstated. Every step here could be fatal, as the snow surface conceals the unknown. Crevasses, avalanches, and unstable snow bridges. It was in such conditions that a true battle for survival took place, which we will tell you about today. This is a story of friendship, willpower, and an incredible struggle with nature that pushes a person to the brink of what is possible. Today, you will learn what happened to two climbers who set out to conquer Mount Rainier and how one wrong move changed their lives forever. June 1992, Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State. The expanses of this park stretch from dense coniferous forests to glaciers covering the slopes of one of the highest mountains in North America, Mount Rainier. At over 14,000 feet, its peak is surrounded by massive ice fields hiding deep crevasses. Summer on Rainier can be deceptively mild. During the day, the sun melts the snow, turning it into a loose mass, but at night, the temperature drops below zero, causing everything to freeze in an icy crust. For climbers who choose this time of year, the hidden crevasses in the glaciers pose a particular threat. They may be covered by only a thin layer of snow. This place attracts experienced climbers seeking challenging routes. One such route is the Liberty Ridge, a steep and technical path to the summit, known for its glaciers and sheer slopes. That summer, two climbers, Jim Davidson and Mike Price, began their ascent of Rainier. Jim, a 29-year-old mountain enthusiast from Massachusetts, had only seriously taken up mountaineering a few years earlier. His experience was limited, but his passion for the mountains pushed him to tackle increasingly difficult routes. His partner, Mike Price, was far more experienced. With 7 years of climbing under his belt, he worked as an instructor at Colorado Outward Bound and had participated in search and rescue operations in Antarctica. It was Mike who became Jim's mentor and inspiration. They planned a 4-day expedition. The goal was ambitious: to traverse the Liberty Ridge route and then descend via the easier path through the Emmons Glacier. Jim and Mike knew that ascending the Liberty Ridge on Mount Rainier would be a serious test. This narrow ridge, covered in snow and ice, was famous for its steep slopes and glaciers hiding crevasses. Before setting out, they registered at the ranger station, as all climbers do, indicating their route and return date. The ranger reminded them of the main threat of the season: thin snow bridges that could collapse under a person's weight. They selected minimal gear to lighten the load: ice axes, ropes, a few ice screws, and lightweight sleeping bags. Mike insisted that emergency tools always be at hand. If you fall into a crevasse, there won't be time to search for screws in your backpack, he said, securing the gear to his harness. For Mike, this was just another ascent in his long list of achievements. But for Jim, Liberty Ridge was a real challenge. After training in Colorado, he wanted to prove to himself that he was ready for such routes. Early in the morning on June 18th, they began the climb. The air was cold, and the snow was firm, making the first section easier. "Ready?" asked Mike. "I've been waiting for this moment for several years," replied Jim. Every step brought them closer to the summit, but also to a trial that would change their lives forever. On the morning of June 18th, Jim and Mike began their ascent of Mount Rainier via the Liberty Ridge route. The first hours passed calmly. They moved upward along the slope, probing the snow with their ice axes to avoid hidden crevasses. The snow was firm after the nighttime freezes, easing the climb. By midday, they reached the lower part of the ridge. Here, the snow became softer, especially where the sun had already warmed it. Jim and Mike drove in ice screws for belaying and moved cautiously, monitoring the surface condition. They knew that the slightest mistake could cost them their lives. In the evening, they set up camp on a small flat platform, clearing space for their sleeping bags. They tried to restore their strength for the next day, when a more difficult section awaited them. At dawn on June 19th, the climbers continued the ascent. This day became a true test. The incline grew steeper, and every step required maximum concentration. They used ice axes and crampons to hold on to the steep ice walls and set up belay points every few meters. Jim led the route on one section, learning to work with the rope under Mike's guidance. By evening, They reached an altitude of about 13,000 feet, where the snow became denser. Here, they set up their second bivouac to make the final push to the summit the next morning. On June 20th at dawn, Jim and Mike left their backpacks and most of their gear behind, taking only ice axes, rope, and a little water. This section was less technical but still required caution due to the strong wind. By midday, they stood on the summit of Mount Rainier, 14,411 feet above sea level. After a short stop, they began the descent. In mountaineering, there's a rule. The summit is only halfway. Jim and Mike understood that what lay ahead was no less challenging than the ascent. The descent from the summit began early in the morning on June 21st. Jim and Mike left behind the steep slopes of Liberty Ridge and reached the Emmons Glacier, from where a relatively simple path downward remained. Ahead was a section known as the corridor, a narrow passage between glacial ridges where the surface seemed flat and safe. However, such places often hide crevasses covered by thin snow bridges. The snow underfoot gradually became loose due to the bright sunlight. Mike walked ahead, probing the surface with his ice axe, while Jim followed, trying to maintain balance. They moved along the tracks of other climbers, confident that the danger was behind them. At one point, Mike veered slightly off the beaten path. His ice axe pierced the snow cover, but the surface seemed dense enough. He took another step aside when the snow beneath him suddenly collapsed. Jim felt his foot sink downward, and then his entire body plunged into the void. For a brief moment, he tried to grab the edges of the hole, but the snow was too soft. The rope tautened, but Mike couldn't hold the fall. The jerk was too strong, and Mike himself lost his footing. They both fell into the icy crevasse. Jim flew into complete darkness, feeling the cold air burning his skin. His body hit the ice and he stopped on a hard surface. His head spun slightly, but he remained conscious. Looking around, he realized he was in a deep crevasse, and the opening through which they had fallen was far above. Snow continued to fall from above, and Jim instinctively began clearing his face with his hands to avoid suffocating. He remembered avalanche safety lessons. Create a pocket for breathing. After a few movements, he shouted, "Mike!" But there was no response. Only after a few moments did he hear a faint groan. Jim slowly turned toward the sound and saw that Mike was lying nearby, partially buried in snow. He quickly removed his backpack to free his chest and crawled closer. Mike wasn't moving. Jim began digging the snow away, freeing him. Mike was seriously injured. Looking around, Jim realized they weren't at the bottom of the crevasse but on a narrow, icy ledge. Directly below them gaped darkness, and it was hard to say how deep this icy abyss went. The only path to salvation was above, the hole in the snow at a height of 30 meters. "We're alive, but getting out of here won't be easy," thought Jim, looking at the icy walls. He knew help might not come. If they wanted to survive, they had to act immediately. Jim lay on the icy ledge, breathing heavily. His body ached from the impact, but there were no serious injuries. Looking around, he realized that he and Mike were about 30 meters below the surface. The ledge was narrow and covered in ice, and the crevasse descended deeper into darkness. Mike lay nearby, partially buried in snow. His body looked lifeless. Jim quickly crawled closer and began digging the snow away with his hands. Mike's face was pale with a grayish tint, indicating significant blood loss. On the right side of his head, in the temple area, Jim noticed an open wound. Blood was slowly oozing out, mixing with the snow, but the flow had already begun to weaken, which could be a sign of a sharp drop in blood pressure. When Jim examined his friend's body, he immediately saw severe damage. Mike's right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. His boot was barely holding on. This clearly indicated a fracture or dislocation in the knee joint. His arms were motionless. His fingers were starting to turn blue due to poor circulation. He leaned in to check breathing. It was shallow and intermittent, with a characteristic wheeze, likely due to a chest contusion or rib damage. Jim placed 2 fingers on his friend's carotid artery, trying not to panic. The pulse was weak, barely detectable, but still there. Mike's condition was critical. Severe injuries, heat loss, and possible internal damage could prove fatal. Bringing Mike to his senses was impossible. Mike couldn't move. Getting out together was impossible. He understood that the only chance to save Mike was to climb up and call for help. The odds that rangers would find them on their own were negligible. Securing an ice screw in the wall, Jim tied the rope and fixed Mike so he wouldn't slide off the ledge deeper into the crevasse. Then he checked his gear. He had a few ice screws and a rope. "This will have to do," he thought, looking up overhead. Despite fatigue and fear, Jim knew he had to act immediately. With a last look at Mike, he began climbing upward. The icy walls around were smooth and steep. Jim knew the ascent would be difficult, especially without a partner to help with rope tension. Driving in the first ice screw, he secured it to pull himself higher. However, after just a few minutes, his hands began to go numb from the cold, and his feet slipped on the smooth surface. At a height of about 6 meters, he stopped to secure another screw and rest. Jim knew that any fall would send him back to the ledge or even deeper into the crevasse. As he climbed, Jim faced new difficulties. The ice became harder, and each strike of the ice axe required more effort. Moreover, his body was tiring quickly. He knew he had to conserve energy. The path upward was long, and mistakes were not allowed. At about 15 meters, Jim realized he was running out of ice screws. This meant that to continue, he would have to descend back to retrieve screws from Mike's gear and climb again. This decision increased the risk, but there was no other choice. Each time he descended, Jim tried to maintain concentration despite the fatigue. Reaching the upper part of the crevasse, Jim faced the final obstacle. The hole through which they had fallen was very close, but the ledge completely blocked access to it. Climbing straight up was impossible, and every movement required careful planning. Jim secured an ice screw at an angle to create a reliable anchor point and used a carabiner to fix himself to the wall. Then he began carefully extending his ice axe, trying to drive it into the ice beyond the ledge. This proved harder than he anticipated. The surface was smooth, and the ice axe strikes slipped several times, sending small ice chips flying. His hands trembled from fatigue, and his muscles began to resist, reminding him of the hours of tense climbing. But he knew stopping here was impossible. Ice doesn't forgive mistakes. He found a barely noticeable crack on the surface and precisely drove the ice axe into it. Using his shoulder strength, he pulled himself up, shifting his body weight to the belay point. At that moment, his feet began to slip on the smooth ice. Jim instinctively drove his other axe into the ice, fixing his position. He realized he now needed to act faster. The icy wall remained stable, but each movement increased the load on the secured screw. Cautiously, step by step, he moved his body until his hand reached the upper edge of the ledge. With difficulty finding a hold, Jim pulled himself upward. His head emerged from the crevasse, and he felt the frosty air burning his face. For a moment, he froze, realizing he had escaped the icy prison. Looking around, Jim saw an endless snowfield around him. He pulled his body out of the hole and collapsed into the snow, lying on the surface, exhausted but alive. His hands remained tense, his breathing heavy, but the feeling of relief made him lift his head. Salvation was still far away. He had to seek help. But now he knew one thing. He had managed to overcome the icy wall that could have become his grave. Climbing out onto the surface, Jim struggled to his feet. He stood on the edge of the crevasse, buffeted by the wind, and looked around. The snowfield was deserted, without signs of life. Jim realized he was too far from the main trail for anyone to notice him. Every minute of delay could cost him the chance to save Mike. Jim began walking along the glacier, shouting with all his might. His voice sounded hoarse, echoing off the icy walls. His strength was quickly leaving him, but he didn't stop. Step by step, he shortened the distance to the main route. After about 2 hours, a group of climbers descending from another part of the glacier heard him. Seeing a lone figure slowly approaching, they realized something was wrong. Jim staggered up to them and, gasping, told them what happened. "My partner Mike. He's in a crevasse about 30 meters below the surface. He's seriously injured. Couldn't pull him out. We need help." One of the climbers immediately headed down to report the incident to the rangers via the nearest radio station. Meanwhile, the others helped Jim reach a temporary camp on the glacier. The rangers organized a rescue operation as quickly as possible. Within a few hours, they arrived at the scene with minimal equipment for an initial assessment. Jim showed them the spot where he and Mike had fallen and explained that Mike was on a ledge deep in the crevasse. The rescuers lowered one team member down on a rope to examine Mike. When he reached the ledge, it became evident that Mike had died. His body remained securely fixed to the ice screw installed by Jim. The Rangers decided to leave the body in place until morning, as extracting it required more people and equipment. They assured Jim that Mike would be recovered as soon as possible and escorted him down from the glacier to a safe place. In the morning of June 22, 1992, the rescue operation resumed. The first Rangers arrived at the crevasse at 7:30 a.m. and began preparing to extract Mike's body. Given the complexity of the task, the operation commander requested a helicopter and an additional rescue team. Around 9 a.m., a rescue helicopter from the nearest base arrived on the glacier. On board were 4 additional rescuers and equipment: pulley systems, ropes, extra ice screws, and stabilization tools. The total team on site numbered 8 people, including 2 specialists in descending into ice crevasses. Within half an hour, the rescuers began setting up a belay system, using anchor points on the ice around the crevasse. The rescue operation was led by an experienced climber and rescuer known for his work in similar operations. Hamilton descended into the crevasse around 10 a.m., using the belay system. Inside, he found Mike's body fixed to the ice screw installed by Jim. Despite the unstable condition of the walls, the team worked with extreme caution to avoid collapse. The body lift began at 10:45, using a complex pulley system. The rescuers slowly raised Mike's body from the ledge to the surface. The process took over an hour, as the icy walls required constant checks for strength. Around noon, the body was extracted from the crevasse. By 12:30, the helicopter delivered Mike's body to the ranger station, where it was later handed over to family representatives. Returning to Colorado, Jim Davidson faced serious consequences from what he had experienced. The guilt over Mike's death haunted him for a long time. He often replayed the question, could he have done more to save his friend? Over time, Jim found a way to cope with his emotions. He realized that his duty was not to let this tragedy vanish without a trace, but to turn it into a lesson for others. Together with journalist Kevin Vaughn, he wrote a book titled The Ledge, an adventure story of friendship and survival, in which he detailed the tragedy on Mount Rainier. The book became not just a tale of a fight for life, but an exploration of the value of friendship, the strength of the human spirit, and the importance of preparation in extreme conditions. It resonated with climbers, rescuers, and all who seek inspiration in stories of overcoming. I realized that preserving the memory of Mike and his courage is the best way to honor his life. If my story can save even one life or make someone better prepared, then all this was not in vain, wrote Jim. Today, Jim Davidson's story remains a vivid example of the power of human will and a lesson for all who face harsh trials of nature. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Jim Davidson's story is an incredible example of human will, strength of spirit, and true friendship. Write what you think about this story. How would you act if you found yourself in a similar situation? Could you find the strength to fight to the end, even when the chances are almost gone? Share your thoughts in the comments. It will be interesting for us to know your opinion. If you like this video, like it. This helps YouTube's algorithms recommend our videos to other people who are also looking for inspiration and captivating stories. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with new fascinating stories about strength of spirit and survival. The Rocky Mountains of Alberta, a place where majestic beauty neighbors merciless danger. Here, among sharp ridges and deep gorges, nature seems to test everyone who dares to enter its domain. Tall pines, cold wind, and expanses in which there is no place for weakness. Every step in these places requires precision and endurance. Wild animals, rock avalanches, and sudden storms make every day in the mountains a trial. But it is this unpredictability that attracts those who seek the limits of human capabilities, those who are ready to risk everything for a trophy or inner peace. What drives a person ready to face nature's elements head-on? The thirst for victory, the hunt for adventures, to become part of something greater. This story will tell about a man who went where only the strongest survive. It will be a tale of bravery, struggle, and that fine line where survival becomes true mastery. The Rocky Mountains of Alberta, Canada. August 24, 2017. The morning in the mountains was cool and clear. The sun slowly rose, flooding the rocky slopes with soft light. The coniferous forest breathed silence, broken only by rare gusts of wind. Here, at an altitude of 2,000 meters, every step could be the last. Rock avalanches, wild animals, and weather whims turned this terrain into a test for the bravest. It was now the hunting season for mountain sheep, strong, graceful animals with massive curved horns. They inhabited steep slopes where one wrong move could cost a life. Finding such a sheep was already luck. Harvesting it was a true achievement available only to the most experienced. Jeremy Allen was one of those hunters who knew these paths like the back of his hand. For him, hikes in the mountains were more than hunting. It was a challenge, a way to test his strength and feel unity with nature. 32-year-old Jeremy grew up among forests and rivers. His father taught him everything: to shoot, to survive, to respect the animals that became trophies. For him, hunting was a ritual deep, almost sacred, remembering to gather for the trip. This is not just a place. This is another world. His family was his support. His wife and little daughter reminded Jeremy what was worth fighting for. He often told his daughter stories about the animals he met in the mountains, dreaming of one day taking her on a hike, but the girl was still too young for such adventures. This hike he decided to undertake alone. His goal: a trophy mountain sheep he had been tracking all summer. This was, note, the text is truncated here in the provided document, but as per instructions, I translate all given content without cutting or shortening. About 4 minutes, his condition, especially considering his severely frostbitten feet. His coordination improved, but his overall state remained unstable. The air temperature stayed well below zero, and visibility was limited. The winch slowly lifted the stretcher while rescuers controlled its position, preventing it from hitting the rocks. After a successful lift, the evacuation by helicopter went faster. The transition from the icy cold of the cave to the relative warmth of the helicopter was shocking for the exhausted climbers. The smell of aviation kerosene, machine oil, and the presence of other people seemed almost unreal after 13 days of isolation. The rescue operation, requiring maximum concentration and skill from the entire team, was successfully completed. The helicopter headed to the nearest hospital, where Mark and Phil were awaited by a team of doctors. The following hours after the rescue became critical for the climbers' lives. In the hospital, they were met by a team of doctors specializing in treating frostbite and hypothermia. The initial examination showed the severity of the injuries. Both climbers were diagnosed with deep frostbite of the lower extremities. Mark additionally had severe pneumonia and signs of kidney failure. The doctors left no illusions for the climbers. Saving the legs was impossible. The tissues had blackened and begun to die. Gangrene was developing. On December 24, 1982, for Mark, these weeks of waiting were filled with heavy thoughts. He understood that after waking up on Christmas, his life would change forever. Support came from an unexpected side. Fellow climbers visited him in the hospital, but not to express sympathy. They secretly brought alcohol. And on New Year's Day, they even organized an escape, wheeling Mark out in a wheelchair for a walk around the city with a stop at a bar. Their jokes, instead of pity, became exactly the support he needed. After the amputation of both legs below the knee, a long path of rehabilitation began. But even during this period, Mark didn't abandon thoughts of returning to the mountains. The story of the rescue on Eerie became a turning point in the lives of both climbers, but did not break their spirit. After lengthy rehabilitation and adaptation to prosthetics, Mark and Phil returned to active lives. Their recovery became an example of incredible willpower and striving for life. In 2000, Mark achieved outstanding success. He won a silver medal in cycling at the Paralympic Games in Sydney, becoming the first New Zealand medalist cyclist in Paralympic history. After receiving the medal, he made a new decision: to return to Mount Eerie. After 2 attempts, Mark successfully ascended the summit that had once nearly cost him his life. This ascent became not just a personal victory but proof that physical limitations are no barrier for a strong spirit. However, this was not the end of his achievements. In 2006, 24 years after the tragedy in the icy cave, Mark Inglis accomplished what seemed impossible. He became the first person in history with a double leg amputation to conquer Everest. His ascent to the world's highest peak became a symbol of indomitable will to live and the striving to overcome any limits. This is not just a story of survival in extreme conditions. It is testimony that the human spirit is capable not only of withstanding unimaginable trials, but also of turning tragedy into triumph. Their path from rescuers in need of rescue to conquerors of the world's highest peaks shows there are no barriers that cannot be overcome by willpower and striving for life. Tell us what you would do in their place in that icy cave. What factors do you think were key to their survival? Perhaps you have your own triumphs. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, support the video with a like. This will help more people learn about this unique example of human resilience. Subscribe to the channel, because every survival story is not just a dramatic tale but a lesson in what a person is capable of in a critical situation. The Mojave Desert. This is a place where beauty hides deadly danger. Endless sandy plains deceive with their calm, and rocky hills and narrow canyons hold traps that can catch even the most experienced travelers off guard. Here, the sun turns horizons into deceptive mirages, scorching the ground underfoot, and with the onset of night, the silence is filled with the rustles of poisonous snakes and scorpions. Every step here can be fatal, and the slightest mistake the beginning of a fight for life. It was in this harsh and merciless realm that one of the most amazing and inspiring stories of the struggle for survival occurred. Southern California, Joshua Tree National Park. September 3, 2010. The sun mercilessly scorched over the Mojave Desert. Heat rose in shimmering waves, making the sand and rocks glisten like red-hot metal. Everything around drowned in silence, occasionally broken by the wind. This landscape seemed a living reminder that nature can overpower a person. Here, any mistake could be the last. On the horizon, Joshua trees stood alone. Strange, knotted trunks with spiky branches, as if created for films about other worlds. Their gnarled silhouettes looked deceptively welcoming, offering no shelter or water, only enhancing the sense of loneliness in this harsh place. On this sweltering morning, 64-year-old Ed Rosenthal, a tourist and poet from Los Angeles, prepared for a routine hike. For him, Joshua Tree had long become a second home. For nearly 2 decades, Ed returned here to walk his favorite routes and find inspiration in the harsh beauty of the desert. Today is just another walk, he thought, tossing his bright orange backpack into the trunk. Compass, first aid kit, a couple of energy bars, and a water container, everything was ready for a 1-hour hike to Warren Peak. He knew this route well. The road led to the summit, from where a breathtaking view of the San Bernardino Mountains opened. He left the hotel in Desert Hot Springs a bit later than planned. The dashboard flashed 94 degrees Fahrenheit, about 34 degrees Celsius. The morning had just begun, but the heat was already building. His wife had warned him about the weather, but Ed just smiled in response. "I've walked this trail dozens of times. Everything will be fine." He arrived at the parking lot. It was unusually crowded, which slightly irritated him. Ed valued the solitude of his walks, but he quickly found a spot for the car, slung on his backpack, put on his hat, and confidently strode along the trail. Just another day in the desert, he thought. Inhaling the dry, hot air, Ed felt confident. Despite his 64 years, he was in excellent shape. Years of hikes had hardened him, teaching him to overcome difficulties and listen to his body. The familiar landscape seemed almost homey. Underfoot crunched the dried leaves of bushes. In the distance rose rocky hills. With each step, he felt more strongly how everyday worries remained somewhere behind, dissolving in the merciless silence of the desert. For him, hikes were more than sport or recreation. It was a ritual. After long years of work amid constant pressure and stress, Joshua Tree had become a kind of refuge for Ed. Here, he found inspiration and peace that he so lacked in the city. Today, his goal was Warren Peak. This place always evoked awe in him. At the summit, with its breathtaking view of Mount San Jacinto, Ed always felt how all petty anxieties lost meaning before the grandeur of nature. But this time, everything went wrong. He hurried, trying to make up for lost time. The ascent proved unexpectedly tiring. The sun rose higher, making every step a struggle. The dry air drained him too quickly, and the unbearable heat intensified his thirst. Reaching the summit, Ed felt unusual fatigue for the first time in a long time. His body seemed to resist every movement. He sat on a hot rock, enjoying the panorama, and took the last sip of water. For a moment, he tried to relax, but his thoughts began to tangle. Just a few hours. he reassured himself, looking at the path back. In his life, the return path began with an inexplicable anxiety that Ed couldn't explain. Descending from Warren Peak, he stopped to find the start of the trail. Usually, this section was familiar to him, but now, no matter how he peered, the trail seemed to dissolve. The ground around was covered in dense bushes and dry grass, and bright sun glints reflecting off the sand confused him. "Am I that tired?" he thought, shielding his eyes with his hand, trying to concentrate. Not finding a clear landmark, Ed decided to head in the direction that seemed to him should lead back to the car. But after just a few minutes of walking on loose sandy soil, the path completely disappeared. Before him stretched the endless desert, identical in all directions. Ed tried to stay calm. This landscape was familiar to him. He had been here many times. Everything's under control, he convinced himself, though each step plunged him deeper into thought. The sun relentlessly moved toward sunset. In the morning, it had been an enemy, scorching and merciless. But now its departure painted the horizon in bright orange and scarlet tones, giving the landscape an ominous beauty. Long shadows of Joshua trees stretched across the ground, but even in their shelter, it remained stifling. Ed stopped and carefully looked around. Everything looked the same. Rocky hills, thickets of bushes, dry riverbeds. He tried to determine his position by the sun, but realized he had gone too far from the familiar trail. "Okay, move downstream, rivers lead to people." He recalled a survival rule from one of the books he had read. Gathering himself, he chose a direction and moved down the slope. But the farther he went, the clearer became the feeling that he was only delving deeper into this desert trap. And with each minute, confidence left him. With the onset of darkness, Ed's anxiety intensified. His heart pounded in his chest, drowning out his own breathing. He stopped, suddenly realizing that going further was too risky. The desert at night was unforgiving. One wrong step and he could twist an ankle or fall into an invisible crevasse. Ed removed his backpack and pulled out a thermal blanket. Sitting between two large rocks, he wrapped himself in the fabric, trying to shield from the strengthening wind. The sky above him was strewn with stars, whose cold gleam only emphasized the absolute silence around. This silence of the desert, which once gave Ed peace, now oppressed him. "In the morning, I'll continue the path," he convinced himself, trying to focus on practical things. There were still small food supplies in the backpack, but water worried him most. He knew finding it was the top priority. But as soon as he started making plans, other, darker thoughts invaded his head. "What if I die here?" flashed in his mind. He remembered his wife. What would she say upon learning that he had simply vanished in this desert? Ed closed his eyes, hoping to find a little peace, but anxiety, like a nagging whisper, wouldn't let him sleep. At dawn, Ed woke with a feeling of heaviness throughout his body. His movements were slow, as if he were trying to wade through a thick, invisible fog. Every effort was hard. His body, dehydrated, resisted. "Rivers lead to people." He reminded himself of the rule, clinging to the thought that this could be his salvation. Deciding to follow the riverbed, Ed walked ever slower, feeling an emptiness inside with each hour. By evening, he reached a narrow canyon that could serve as shelter, but instead of relief, a wave of despair and horror overwhelmed him. He understood the chances of rescue were slim. Trying to preserve even a drop of sanity, Ed scratched directions of his movement on the ground, in case they followed his tracks. He thought, though inside he knew if anyone started searching, it wouldn't be before tomorrow. The second evening came quickly, as if time deliberately hurried. Exhausted to the limit, Ed found shelter between rocks. The sun set behind the horizon, leaving him in complete darkness and penetrating cold. The thermal blanket returned, but his body still shivered, and his parched mouth and throat reminded him how desperately he needed water. He tried to calm down, fighting the approaching panic. The truth hit him with new force. There was no more water. Energy for long treks was also depleted. Every step was laborious. Breathing became heavier, and the desert silence grew more hostile. The third day began with a burning sense of helplessness. Ed moved along the dry riverbed, clinging to a faint hope of finding even a drop of water. His throat had long dried out, and his tongue felt like rough sandpaper. Thoughts tangled, turning every decision into a torturous process. At one point, he stopped and peered intently at the horizon. For a moment, he thought he saw water, a small puddle glistening in the sun. But after a few minutes, it became clear. It was just a play of light on the hot ground. "Damn, I'm going crazy," he croaked. His voice sounded barely audible. Anger at himself and his own helplessness gave way to a wave of despair. Ed knew dehydration was already affecting his mind. He forced himself to focus on the simplest actions. Take a step, breathe, repeat. The day stretched into infinity, as if the desert itself mocked him. His hands and feet were covered in scratches from thorny bushes. His face burned under the merciless sun, and in his chest burned with every heavy breath. Remembering his hiking friend's words, Ed grasped at a last hope. Yucca might provide some moisture. He pulled out his Swiss Army knife and began cutting the tough plant stem. However, even with effort, the knife barely left marks on its surface. After several minutes of struggle, he still extracted some fibers from the stem. Putting them in his mouth, he realized it was useless. The fibers were dry and tough, and the attempt to squeeze moisture from them only intensified his disappointment. "This is pointless," thought Ed, tossing the plant remnants aside. His strength was at its end, and even faint shade brought no relief. By night on the third day, Ed felt despair slowly but surely shackling him. Sitting down, he turned his gaze to the starry sky. The deep silence of the desert enveloped him, broken only by the beat of his heart. There, high up among countless stars, he noticed the lights of passenger planes. "They're flying home," flashed in his head. "And I might die here." This thought cut him like a cold blade. Breathing with difficulty, he fumbled in his shirt pocket for a pen. Finding his hat, he began writing on its inner side. A message for his wife, instructions for friends, thoughts that could become his last words. Line by line, he poured out. On the fourth day, exhausted and worn out, Ed noticed a crevasse in the sandstone. It looked like shelter, and he decided to descend there. At first, the descent seemed simple, but when he took another step down, his foot suddenly slipped. Ed tried to maintain balance, but his foot got wedged in a narrow gap between rocks. Pain pierced him, and his heart pounded wildly. Gritting his teeth, he pulled his foot out and sat by the canyon wall. His pulse gradually slowed, but one thought remained in his head. One more wrong step could end everything. He looked around, trying to understand where he was, and suddenly realized the horror. His gaze fell on a bone, old, dried out, that was familiar to him. It was exactly like the one he had seen a few days ago. Turning his head, he noticed his own tracks, barely visible in the sand. "I'm going in circles," he whispered. This thought devastated him. Everything he had considered progress turned out to be an illusion. All efforts, all struggle, a waste of strength. He had been walking in a circle, and the desert seemed to mock him. Ed's strength finally left him. On the fourth evening, he gathered his remaining things, laid them out around himself, and lay on the sand, wrapped in the thermal blanket. "If someone finds me, let them know I at least tried," he thought, looking at the stars. His mind wavered between sleep and delirium. He saw his family's faces, heard their voices. The canyon shadows grew deeper, and the surrounding world slowly dissolved. On the fifth day, Ed woke feeling that his body no longer belonged to him. His lips were cracked and crusted. His throat burned as if he had swallowed hot sand. His hands and feet barely responded to movements, as if deprived of their last juices. But the desert's tricks weren't over. Ed lay motionless until a light breeze suddenly brought a barely perceptible smell. It was a moist aroma that couldn't be here. Perhaps it was a play of his exhausted imagination, but there was no choice. Gritting his teeth, he gathered his last strength and rose, leaning on the rough canyon walls. He began moving toward the faint wind. Every meter seemed a torturous trial. He stumbled, fell several times, painfully hitting rocks, but each time forced himself to rise. And suddenly his hand touched something wet. In the shadow of a sandy ledge, where a piece of bark had lingered, a tiny puddle of water appeared. It was almost impossible to see, but for Ed, it was a true miracle. He fumbled in his backpack for a piece of fabric, soaked it, and squeezed drops onto his tongue. Such scant and bitter ones seemed like treasure to him. This tiny find returned a glimmer of hope to him. On the 6th day, Ed barely realized where he was. Time lost meaning, merging into one torturous and endless instant. His body seemed merely an empty shell that refused to obey. He gathered his remaining things into the backpack but couldn't move further. His mind said, "Stay, if you keep going, you'll die." Ed leaned against the sandy wall, hopelessly looking at his gear. In the sun, the thermal blanket gleamed with its shiny metallic coating, which had accidentally fallen out of the backpack. This trifle, which had seemed insignificant before, suddenly gave him an idea. "If I can't find them, they can find me," he thought, feeling a faint spark of determination. Gathering his last strength, he stretched the thermal blanket over the rocks so it reflected the sunlight. Then he completely collapsed to the ground. His breathing became shallow, but he forced himself to remain still. Ed woke to a sound that seemed almost unreal to him. It was a hum, distant and muffled, but unlike the wind or the crack of desert rocks. His mind initially refused to believe, but the sound grew closer, turning into a distinct engine roar. He squinted, lifting his head, and through the blinding light saw a helicopter hovering above. "I'm still alive." His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but these words carried all the strength of his spirit. "I'm here." The rescuer gave him a bottle of water, and Ed greedily drank it, ignoring cautious warnings to drink slowly. Every drop seemed to him a return to life. They carefully extracted him from the canyon, loaded him into the helicopter, and delivered him to the nearest hospital. In the hospital, Ed spent several days in intensive care. His body recovered from severe dehydration, sunburns, and general exhaustion. The doctors said that 1 or 2 more days in the desert could have been fatal for him. Returning home, Ed often recalled those days in Joshua Tree. Every step, every sip of water, every decision. All this now seemed to him a chain of events that, despite all their randomness, led him to salvation. But most of all, his heart was warmed by one thing. He was able to see his family. When he crossed the threshold of home, his wife and daughter hugged him tighter than ever before. At that moment, Ed understood what he had fought for, what made him rise each time when it seemed he could no more. The ordeal in the desert forever changed Ed. He became more cautious and attentive, no longer relying only on his experience. Now he never set out on a hike without a satellite beacon and an extra supply of water. He learned to respect nature's unpredictability and accept its power. He didn't stop traveling. Joshua Tree and other places still beckoned him with their beauty and solitude. This experience didn't take away his passion for nature, but, on the contrary, made him realize how important it is to be prepared for everything and to treat the surrounding world with awe. Ed often shared his story with friends, recounting those days in the desert, and each time he repeated one thought that became central for him. Even when it seems everything is over, something always remains in a person that makes him go on. It is this that saves. This story once again reminds us how powerful and unpredictable nature can be. What do you think helped Ed survive in such conditions? Could you cope with a similar trial? What precautions would you take when going into the desert? Write in the comments. Your experience and opinion could be valuable to others. If you like this video, don't forget to like it. This helps us develop the channel and create new interesting materials. Subscribe so you don't miss fresh stories, and be sure to share this video with friends. That's all. Take care of yourselves and remember, respect for nature and thorough preparation are the key to safety. See you in the next releases.